Good morning, everyone. My name is Meryl Ainsman. I'm a member of the Executive Steering Committee for the Eradicate Hate Conference. And on behalf of the Steering Committee, I want to apologize. I know things are so clumped together that it's hard to get from one room to the next and get settled, both for the speakers as well as the participants. So welcome. This is a session for the Constitutional Sheriff's Movement, how extremists are infiltrating law enforcement, which I'm very interested to hear about. Our moderator is Barbara Harding from Jones Day, and the panelists, we have two coming in virtually, and two, Heidi Barrack and Mary McCord, who are here in person. And the two on video will be Mark Pitkovich and Emily Ferris. So we'll get started. And as I think you all know the drill by now, QR codes in the corner if you have questions, or I think it's a small enough group, you know, if you really want to ask a question and don't want to deal with that, just raise your hand. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Barbara Harding from Jones Day. I'm a former federal prosecutor with the Department of Justice in the criminal section of the Civil Rights Division, which is actually a pretty important group right now with respect to this discussion. And I also co-chair our firm's Hate Crime Task Force. And so I'm honored to be here with you all today. I want to thank you for coming to talk with us about this kind of very timely topic regarding constitutional sheriffs. And we have a force with us today, both virtually and in person, who have been trying to warn the country about this group, some of them probably for decades. And so I want to thank them for joining us, and we're going to get right to it because we've got a lot of ground to cover. So Heidi, you have been tracking and warning about this group for a number of years, both at the Southern Poverty Law Center and now at your current organization that spends its life trying to combat this kind of extremism. Can you give us the essential background of the Constitutional Sheriff's Movement, and with a focus a little bit on their ideology and their kind of current organizations around the country and their numbers?
Yeah, sure. And you want me to go ahead and do the PowerPoint?
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks. I could skip my name. So the Constitutional Sheriff's Movement has been around for quite a while. It's rooted in anti-government movements and thinking, which are basically lies, about the idea that a sheriff is the highest law enforcement entity in their county. And that the federal government sort of has no authority over them. Federal government can't tell you what to do about gun laws, vaccine, pandemic measures, whatever it might be. It's very rooted in what's called sovereign citizens ideology, and it goes back a ways to groups like the Posse Comitatus. And it's, as much as I would like to think there was only one sheriff who believed this, or maybe zero, that's not the case. So you just see here from the slide that they, believe they can determine what the law is. The Constitutional Sheriff's Movement, which is made up of two main organizations, there were people with ties to this in the Capitol insurrection. It has been connected to groups with white supremacist beliefs, movements literally against federal action, people like related to the Bundy Ranch takeover and other things, where they have literally rejected federal authority in the face of federal authorities. I already mentioned the COVID movement, which I think the pandemic radicalized more sheriffs into this movement than had been in it before. And when I say more sheriffs, the one of the main groups, CSPOA, Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, run out of Arizona by a guy named Sheriff Mack, who's been in the anti-government movement forever. A few years ago when I was at SPLC, I think we counted about 420 sheriffs across the nation who were involved, and the numbers are in that range. Today there's good work by others like Political Research Associates documenting that. And when I say that, 400, some of these people are in charge of counties that are bigger than Connecticut, right? These are western counties, they're massive, but they're also in urban counties. They're not necessarily just in the middle of nowhere. That's a picture of Sheriff Mack there on the left, and he has become actually increasingly radical since he founded CSPOA a few decades ago. In other words, he's been raging at the federal government in more extreme ways than before.
And we're gonna spend a fair amount of time talking about him.
Yeah, that's
later
just
today.
a map that shows you where the sheriffs are. I'll just say a couple other things. These movements, these sheriff's movements, are connected to other anti-government movements like the Oath Keepers, so there's overlap. For example, the sheriff of Riverside County in California was in both organizations. And lately, the thing that I'm most worried about, I know my colleagues are going to talk about here, is that the other group, Protect America Now, which is also a constitutional sheriff's outfit run by a guy named Sheriff Lamb. He's a functioning sheriff in Pinal County in Arizona. They have been getting involved. This is the propaganda they put out. And I should say, this is not like a fringe thing or necessarily an all kind of white thing, which people sometimes think. If you go on Sheriff Lamb's page, it's a little shocking. You got people in Delaware, Connecticut, also out west, and of many ethnicities and backgrounds who are sitting sheriffs who are involved. And I just want to say, I should have said this earlier. There's a sheriff in Michigan who's connected to these folks who literally was hanging around with militia guys and defended the people who were accused of wanting to kidnap Governor Whitmer in Michigan. So that shows you where you can end up. Here he is on stage with his militia friends. I just want to say one last thing that I'm more worried about than anything else, which is that these groups have now injected themselves into issues over the election. So both Sheriff Mack and Sheriff Lamb's group are working with election deniers and are talking about the fact that they're going to insert themselves into the midterms. They're working with groups like True the Vote, which is involved in election denial. And they're talking about doing things like seizing voting machines and other ways that they might end up trying to influence the elections. And I think that's something we very much need to be worried about. You can see there, protectamerica.vote, which is True the Vote and Lamb's outfit.
Right.
So I'll stop there.
Well, and we'll come back. We'll end, with a pretty significant discussion about the election issue, and it's telling. I think we have a fairly substantial crowd in here on Wednesday at the end of this conference. I think because the people in this conference recognize the threat that this group poses to our democracy and the rule of law, because they're supposed to be part of our rule of law. And so, Mary, I want to turn to you. And you all probably all know Mary as well if you haven't seen RMH Ramada or more recently with Nicole Wallace. She is the head of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown and the former Deputy Attorney General for National Security, acting Attorney General. Yes, sorry. I got that wrong, Mary. But you all know her, and she has been just, passionate about trying to educate our country and particularly law enforcement about the dangers of groups like the constitutional sheriffs. And so could you talk with us about the legal foundation or lack of foundation that the constitutional sheriffs have under our current structure, our legal structure?
Yeah, well, it's a made-up thing. It's, the word sheriff doesn't appear in the U.S. Constitution. There's no authority for a sheriff to say, I'm the highest law of the land. If you go on Sheriff Mack's CSPOA website, he'll say that sheriffs have more power even than the President of the United States. Who knew? Most sheriffs are actually created by the state constitutions, and they are elected in almost all cases. To give some parameters to Heidi's numbers of something like 400 who adhere to the movement, there are about 3,000 sheriffs in the United States, and their authority derives from either their state constitution or state laws. In most cases, the state constitution allows the legislature to provide for what the duties of the sheriffs will be. And it really harkens back, the sheriffs go back to the time before we had organized police forces, right? So they go back to the common law, and I just want to read you that at common law, mostly what the sheriff was responsible for were things like preserving the peace, preventing and suppressing all affrays, breaches of the peace, riots, and insurrections, often also protecting public buildings, serving process, and running the jails. In some places, they still have that kind of broad authority in their jurisdictions, but where there are cities within their jurisdictions that have police forces and police chiefs, then there's often a shared authority or some sort of designation by the legislature or by mutual agreement that the police force will do all of the law enforcement within the municipality, whereas the sheriffs will engage in law enforcement in the rest of the county. Sheriffs also, in some states, the state has very much restricted their authority, and in some areas they're responsible for really nothing more than serving process and running the jails. So when sheriffs say they have this sort of, higher authority, higher than any law in the land, that's just not grounded in U.S. Constitution or state constitutions or any kind of, law created by the courts.
Thank you, Mary. Do they, it's interesting if you go online and you just put in constitutional sheriffs, it's kind of disturbing because first comes up Wikipedia, and then second comes up Southern Poverty Law Center. Thank goodness that comes up. But then right after that is the CPOSA, and it looks, and you click on it, and it looks so official. And you read what they say, and it sounds so, I'm not going to say it sounds necessarily reasonable, but it's grounded in kind of a sense of protection of our country and protection of individual rights. And so it's disturbing that it's so normalized. Yeah. And so with respect to the law, and these are individuals who are charged with enforcing law, how is it that the groups that are recruiting other sheriffs, how are they attracting them to believe that they're actually lawful?
Right. So they call themselves constitutional sheriffs because of the oath they take to support and defend the Constitution, right? But of course, it's the Constitution as they interpret it, whether that's consistent with history, text, or court precedent. So for example, they will say, if we don't agree with a particular law, we think it's unconstitutional, say gun regulation, for example, they'll just decide they're not going to enforce it. And so I think partly the way that they recruit is they recruit like-minded people who are very pro sort of absolutist view of the Second Amendment, who are very anti-immigration, and who are frankly anti-government, even though they are part of the government. And they are elected, remember? So unlike police chiefs who are answerable to their city manager or their local officials, can be fired by them, what have you, sheriffs are elected, and in many cases can only be removed by a recall campaign or the next election. In some states, the governor has authority to remove for cause if approved by the legislature, but that's a minority of the states. So they can say the kind of things that police chiefs just would not say, and they can do that to recruit. And because they're elected, they've kind of got their finger on the pulse of their own communities. And oftentimes, now I also don't want to badmouth all sheriffs. There are plenty of very excellent sheriffs, around the country. I mean, we have a sheriff who just announced down in Texas opening an investigation of the, transporting of migrants without their knowledge and through what appears to be fraud up to Martha's Vineyard. So I am not bad-mouthing all sheriffs. Many are good people. But those in this movement, they are oftentimes, in jurisdictions where what appeals is this kind of pro-gun, pro-militia, anti-government, anti-immigrant viewpoint. And just to, go back to the idea of the websites, if you go to Sheriff Lamb's website, Protect America, you know what he asks you to donate? $17.76 a month, right? I mean, this is insurrectionist language coming from people responsible for law enforcement. So, even within their states, their state constitutions and state laws are supreme to them. So there's a real problem when they decide unilaterally, we're not going to enforce the law. Now, sometimes people say to me, well, Mary, you were a prosecutor a long time. Didn't you sometimes decide, I'm not going to prosecute a particular case? You exercise your judgment on that. What's different about that? We have prosecutors right now saying, I'm not going to enforce these anti-abortion criminal penalties. What's the difference? And, there is a difference between discretion in a particular case, I think, and then just blatantly saying, this is unconstitutional, I'm not going to enforce it, writ large across the board. And in some cases, we've seen sheriffs actually supporting militias. Sheriff Lamb himself has talked about calling up militias and deputizing them to help him do his, law enforcement. He's in Virginia, when we had a number of counties pass Second Amendment sanctuary resolutions saying they were against any new enforcement of gun laws. In some cases, we had sheriffs supporting that measure. And that's really just defiance of state law. So that's how it manifests in, a problem on the ground, but also a legal problem.
Okay, thanks. I want to come back at the end. Don't let me forget. I want to talk about kind of the role of judges also in this equation. Mark, I'd love to bring you into the conversation now. Thank you for being patient, and as well, you, Emily, as well. So, Mark, at the ADL, I know that you've been following this movement and studying it for a long time, and how it was created, the environment that led to the state of the movement today. Would you tell us about Richard Mack, who he is, how he has helped, kind of create, grow, and expand the constitutional sheriff's movement? Wait, hold on, Mark. We can't hear you. Let's wait 1 second. I want to make sure, is your speaker on?
It looks like
it's muted here.
It looks like it's muted here, so give us 1 second. They're working on it. Can you hear us? Okay. Oh, can you try again, Mark?
We see that little white symbol in the bottom corner.
You all see the microphone that's
Well, hers is a microphone, and then there's the white symbol that means it's from here, right?
I think so, yeah.
Want to try again, Mark? Oh, still not working, sorry.
Yeah, I'm looking at this, but I don't know if that's...
Emily, can we hear you?
She's muted.
Did you say something, Emily? Oh, okay.
They're both muted from
They're
here.
both muted from here.
She took her mute off.
Okay, all right. All right, well, they are...
Move on.
Yeah, well, they're working on the problem, and I promise we'll get back to you all. Why don't we talk briefly then, until we get back and do a deeper dive into Sheriff Mack. Could we talk a little bit about the current, kind of the most current pressing issue, which I believe to be the issue of the elections. Mm-hmm. So maybe, Heidi, you want to start and talk with us a little bit about what the constitutional sheriff's movement is saying about elections and the different organizations that are out there threatening to interfere.
Yeah, the two that I'm most concerned about are Sheriff Mack's outfit, CSPOA, and then Sheriff Lamb's outfit, which is the official partner now with a group called True the Vote, which is located in Texas, to engage in this election space. And I should just say a bit about True the Vote. They produced the film 2000 Mules, helped produce the film 2000 Mules, which is just a completely fraudulent film about manipulations in the elections. And what True the Vote has claimed, with no evidence to back it up, is that they followed all these vote mules who were manipulating the process in the 2000 election. There was an event in Las Vegas this past summer with the three groups, Mark Lamb's, Max, and True the Vote, about how corrupt the election system is, and that sheriffs have a legal authority to engage in oversight of the election. And they have talked about things like surveillance of drop boxes, surveillance of voters, manipulations of things like poll workers, seizing ballot boxes in the aftermath and checking doing like audit type things. So there's a whole range of activities that I think are very concerning here that these people are up to. And this is not just in Arizona and Texas. It's in multiple locations that they're going to engage in this. One other thing about True the Vote, it is under investigation for all kinds of corruption related to the money that it's raised. So it just throws this additional wild card. It's not just the election lies, the injection into the election system, but these are some problematic people in general.
Could I just add to that they've also launched, or they're planning to launch, although I'm not sure it's gone live yet, an election integrity hotline, right? And I put integrity in these air quotes because those are the buzzwords now that sound objectively neutral, but is, you know, the way they actually speak about it, it's not that at all. And they're raising money to provide resources for sheriffs to go out and undertake this meddling in election administration.
So, Mary, what is happening to counter this movement? What are the efforts that are out there and that people can possibly get involved in if they're concerned?
Sure. So, you know, one of the things about any kind of extremism or rogue sheriffs like this is the more you talk about it, does it just give them free airtime? And I think that some of us, even though we've been trying to call attention to it, have not sort of raised lots of alarm bells about this particular alliance out of concern it would just give it a whole lot more publicity. But now it's to the point, you know, they had a big convention in Las Vegas this summer where they all announced that this alliance, it made a lot of press. They're launching this election integrity hotline, and we're actually seeing examples of sheriffs going and, you know, starting to ask questions of election officials. We saw this in Johnson County, Kansas, you know, talking about what do you do to protect elections, and we should be the ones transporting ballots from the ballot boxes to the offices, and shouldn't we arrange for various voter surveillance? And the city attorney there did what I think most city attorneys would do, is say, hold up, let me look at the laws here. In this state, you don't have that authority to engage in an election administration. In fact, in no state that I'm aware of, and we have guidance coming out, draft of it here. Oh, there we have something. I think that might be from here, though. We have guidance coming out specifically to go out to election officials, to law enforcement, to state officials, attorneys general, district attorneys, saying, look, if you've got a sheriff coming and starting to ask these kind of questions, check your state law, because in no state that I'm aware of does a sheriff have any authority over election administration. That's usually run from the Secretary of State's offices, elected boards of, election commissions, and local election officials. Now, and so, you know, in Johnson County, the city attorney basically said, back off. You know, you run the public, you provide security for the public buildings, and you serve process. You don't get involved in election administration. So knowing the laws in your state, and election officials taking, you know, don't just answer any question when the sheriff comes asking them. Make sure that the sheriff has some authority over it. It might be different if the sheriff is investigating criminal laws, because in some states, as I said earlier, they do have pretty broad criminal law enforcement. So if they're actually saying we're investigating fraud that occurred in an election already, there's more leeway there for them in some states, not every state. So again, you need to check the laws and see what they're responsible for. But even then, they have to comply with the US Constitution, right? You can't seize a voting machine without probable cause that it's evidence of a crime, right? All those constitutional principles under the US Constitution still apply.
Okay, thanks, Mary. And how are we doing? Are we good now? We have a question in the audience, and we'll go to that right now.
So we're talking about the sheriffs, but every county or every state has state police, local police. Are they in conflict? And what happens in jurisdictions where there might be conflict between both the sheriff's office, state police, and local police? Is this happening, or is it talking as if there's no other law enforcement available in these areas? And you actually have a lot of other law enforcement.
Yeah.
So how is that either conflicting or meshing, or is everybody ignoring everybody else?
No, that's, and
I'm going to repeat the question for the online audience. The question involves kind of the role of local police and municipality and other law enforcement, local law enforcement. Let's talk about them first,
Right.
and what's their role here.
Right. So in counties where you have a jurisdiction, a municipality, a city, town, what have you, that has a police force, sometimes by state law, the police force has primary responsibility within that city, and the sheriff has primary responsibility in the county outside that city. Sometimes if it's not designated by state law, it's by mutual agreement, basically by contract, that within the city, the police chief and the police department will have primacy, and outside the city, it will be the sheriff. And sometimes they work together, but it's not just like, it's generally not overlapping. Sometimes even within a city, the sheriff will still run the courthouse and the jail, but the police department will run all law enforcement. So we don't just have that type of conflict, generally speaking.
What about state police?
State police also, their authority is also different, and it's designated by statute. And where it overlaps, then there are memorandums of understanding or state statutory provisions that provide for that division.
And it's a great question, and we're actually going to come back at the end and talk about kind of the problems that constitutional sheriffs pose for law enforcement generally in a number of areas. So we'll delve into that a little further down the line. But Mark, can we hear you now? I just want to test it before I ask the question again.
Am I coming through?
Yes, excellent. All right.
Yay.
Yay, great. I know I'm excited because there's a lot of people here that want to hear from you. You've been, following this movement for a long time. Can you just tell us more about Richard Mack and his movement and how it's evolved, and what are the factors that have allowed it to germinate like this?
I'd be happy to, because I think it's really important to understand how Richard Mack was able not only to make an unusually successful extremist group, but actually to create a constitutional sheriff's ecosphere or movement in which there are a number of other groups also active to varying degrees. And I think the most important thing is, as you may have noticed because of everybody referring to him, he is a former sheriff from rural Graham County in Arizona. But he also sort of became a celebrity on both the right and the far right in the 1990s because he was one of two sheriffs who successfully sued to overturn key provisions of the Brady law, the handgun control law in the 1990s. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And during that time, while it was working its way through the courts, he crisscrossed the whole country promoting the lawsuit to endless series of groups and audiences, both mainstream and extreme, however he could get, from the John Burt Society to militia groups. And in fact, he did this so much that it actually played a role in him losing re-election because he was always out of the state. And after that, he unsuccessfully tried to run for several other offices, but gradually moved more and more towards the far right himself. And essentially, while he struggled to make an everyday living, he continued on the right-wing speaking circuit, making use of his status as a former sheriff and his sort of celebrity Brady law status. He became a vocal supporter of the militia movement. He would speak from, everybody when the Tea Party movement arises after Obama is elected, he starts speaking at Tea Party events. And in fact, at that same time, he joins the Oath Keepers, a group within the militia movement that tries to particularly recruit from current or former military, first responders, or police. And he became one of the most prominent members, sort of a celebrity member of the Oath Keepers, and was a real draw for the group. And it was in this sort of time period, 2009, 2010, 2011, that he developed his constitutional sheriff ideas and started talking about them and promoting them with sort of the relentless traveling and speaking that he was capable of. And by 2011, he decided, he didn't need to rely on the Oath Keepers for anything. He could start his own group, and he starts the CSPOA. And then from that point on, really focuses on promoting the constitutional sheriff's theory to, anybody who would really listen. Mainstream groups, borderline groups, in-person speaking all around the country, online interviews, and very opportunistic in trying to reach out to new audiences or capitalize on new issues. In the past year or two, he has spoken at QAnon-related venues. He has spoken with Mike Lindell and other Stop the Steal type events, as well as other extremist or mainstream events. Just this past weekend, he spoke in Texas at the annual conference of the Far West Texas County Judges and Commissioners Association. So, you can see he's trying to reach out to these sorts of officials, and these have borne fruit. Recently in Nevada, he actually got 3 counties in Nevada, county governments, to actually formally become members of the CSPOA. Not individual county commissioners. He actually got them to sign the entire county into this as members of the CSPOA.
So Mark,
you actually have governmental entities as members of extremist groups.
It's interesting because we have a question from the audience, which is, what do you make of the APOA's effort to designate constitutional counties? Do you have serious concern about what that will mean for rule of law in those counties, or is it a meaningless label? So what do you, I don't think it's a meaningless label, but I'm curious to hear your response to that.
Well, I mean, a lot of it depends on what the people do, whether they actually just do it as a symbolic gesture, or if they actually try to change policies or interfere with federal or state governments or laws in some way. So a lot of that really depends. But I do want to mention one last thing with regard to Richard Mack and the Constitutional Sheriffs Movement. And that is, we've mentioned the CSPOA and we've mentioned Mark Lamb's group, that Protect America Now, sort of a CSPOA light. But there are a lot of other groups out there that are part of this movement too. I mean, from the very beginning, there were groups that formed to support the CSPOA or the idea of constitutional sheriffs, like, for example, the National Constitutional Sheriffs Association. And most extremist groups don't last very long, and some of the early ones are already gone now. But there are actually a wealth of them out there now, often organized at the state level, sort of in the regional level within a state, or even for a particular county. So just to give a couple examples, we have the Idaho Constitutional Sheriffs. This is a group trying to elect constitutional sheriffs in all of Idaho's 44 counties. The Sheriff Brigades of Pennsylvania trying to do the same thing. In Northeast Iowa, there's a group called We the People for Constitutional Sheriffs. And there are also other groups supporting the concept of constitutional sheriffs now. So, for example, there's a right-wing police association called the American Police Officers Alliance, which now promotes the idea of constitutional sheriffs. And other groups even unrelated to law enforcement. So, for example, there's a group, sort of a anti-pandemic, anti-vaccine sort of group, Stand for Health Freedom. On their website, they have a whole page on the theme that your sheriff could be your greatest health freedom ally. And they actually provide sample emails that you can send to your local sheriff to sort of get them on board with whatever your anti-vax or other notions are. And we also have other people out there, sort of disciples of Richard Mack, giving presentations and trainings the same way he has. So, for example, Chris Ann Hall, who sometimes does training for Richard Mack, she's a quote-unquote constitutional attorney. She also offers, along with her husband, their own online constitutional sheriff trainings. And Dar Leaf, the Michigan sheriff that I think Heidi referenced as being on the same stage with militia members, he's actually partnered with a sovereign citizen guru to offer a 12-session, quote-unquote, common law sheriff course. So he's actually training alongside a sovereign citizen, with another online course. And, when you add in all sorts of Facebook groups and pages and other social media, it really is a growing movement that has a increasing number of actors in it, which is really concerning.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it. And we've got a number of questions coming in, and I'm going to get to them. But I do want to, Emily, I want to turn to you. And as an academic, you've been following this movement for a long time. Can you talk to us about how it's evolved? We've heard a little bit about it, but I'd like for you to really maybe take a little bit of a deeper dive into kind of the different ways it's evolved and this aspect of training that's out there in terms of recruitment.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. So I have been studying this for about a decade and have done most of the work looking through surveys of sheriffs, as well as just studying and watching kind of what they're doing. And so we just did our last survey in November of 2021, and we asked sheriffs, we had about 500 respondents, a representative sample. I could get into all of that. But we asked them specifically about the CSPOA. It's really hard to get numbers, right? Mac isn't publicly releasing all of his lists, and he has his own incentives, right, to kind of up the numbers. I think probably, numbers like 500, 400 might show how many folks maybe care about guns on a certain, they'll sign a letter. He has a much smaller kind of core of supporters, we find. So, of our 500, about 5%, 25 said that they were actually members of Mac's group. But what I think, and what my co-author, as well as we partner with the Marshall Project, find really interesting is that his support is much wider. And of course, Richard Mack loves my findings, talking about how he has expanded beyond his own organization. But we find that like 20% say that they support the organization, but more interesting that they over 200 agree with him that their authority supersedes state and federal government. More than 300 say that they're willing to interpose themselves between kind of a higher government authority and their own constituents. And what we find is that this plays out actually now in the policies too. So we had done previous work looking at like domestic violence and immigration and found that, it's really obvious, but who you elect as sheriff really matters, that personal attitudes then shape the policies they do. But what we're seeing now is that this right-wing extremism, which I could get into how we measure it, but that really matters for things like COVID policy, for red flag laws and things like that. And so like 30% of sheriffs are saying, yeah, we had a mask mandate in my county, but I'm not going to enforce that. And so the same goes for looking at the relationship between right-wing extremism. So sheriffs who score higher on right-wing extremism then are much more likely to be like, declining to do these kinds of things. And so it's interesting to see how Mac has been able to kind of infuse his ideas more broadly through sheriffs, maybe through his trainings, but also just through kind of mainstreaming some of these ideas within Republicans and the Conservative Party more broadly.
Thank you, Emily. We've got a question here. I think it's really relevant. What can be done to stop CSPOA and PAN from training law enforcement? How do we get them blacklisted? So I put that out there to the panel to maybe describe what PAN is to those who might not know in the audience, and this relationship with training and how we can get the kind of constitutional sheriffs movement out of training law enforcement. Does anybody want to take that?
I mean, I can start. Maybe Emily has more on this. We've been seeing more and more of an issue, and there'll be a panel later today on extremism in law enforcement and how to get it out of law enforcement. But one of the problems is that there is very little regulation of the trainers. In many states, there's basically none. Or there's something like, send us your PowerPoint presentation that you use and they'll check it off. Well, the PowerPoint presentation probably doesn't have all the bad stuff on it. It's that delivery, right? And so, unfortunately,
and the legitimacy you get from being the deliverer.
Exactly. And so what we've seen, and I think it was Reuters that did a kind of investigative reporting on this that you can look up, where they had, gotten into the trainings of a number of different, and not just all CSPOA, but a number of different law enforcement trainers. They hang out a shingle, they say, I'm former law enforcement, I'm going to do training. And they're very, very openly, racist, misogynist, xenophobic, anti-government in their presentation, and obviously this is going to have an impact on the force that they're training. But until there becomes more of a regulation, we're sort of in this reliant on police departments to do better at determining who they're going to hire. And so part of the idea behind some of this guidance that we're working on with others, States United and others, is to say to police chiefs, hey, have you talked to your trainers about who they're hiring to do the training? Have you looked through the curriculum? Have you sat in it? Because we need to not have any kind of extremist rhetoric or constitutional sheriff's rhetoric in our training. Another option out there is probably every law enforcement office in the country gets some money from DOJ through their different grant programs for law enforcement. And, these are things DOJ can put as a condition, right, that you've got to have approved trainers to do your training. Now, that means you've got to come up with a mechanism for approving trainers and maybe a curriculum, but that's probably what should happen.
Okay. And anybody else have a comment on that, on the training issue? Mark?
Yeah, I'd like to add something. Every state has, they may use different names. They have what are called POSTs, Peace Officer Standard and Training Organizations, that theoretically provide some degree of facilitation, organization, and in some cases oversight of at least certified trainings for law enforcement. Trainings that essentially provide continuing education credit for law enforcement. So far, some of these posts have largely tried to duck this issue. In 2 states, in Texas and Montana, the posts have actually certified Richard Mack's presentations for law enforcement. And I was speaking with a reporter recently who actually talked to one of the representatives in one of those states about this, and they essentially said I'm repeating this secondhand, but they essentially said they sent an observer to one of the trainings and didn't notice anything problematic. And the way he explained it to the reporter seemed to think that they went there looking for racism, and they didn't find racism, so it wasn't a problem. And this is actually, Richard Mack and some of these others are benefiting from the fact that in the general public, there's an association of right-wing extremism with white supremacy. There's not a good understanding that there are other types of extremism and that those are also dangerous. And so a lot of people, if they can't see clear evidence of white supremacy, don't actually think there's a problem. And anti-government extremism can cause tremendous amounts of problems, up to including major acts of violence. It doesn't have to be associated with white supremacy, but this is something Mac has actually benefited from. But if post organizations could be more aggressive, if they were willing to be, they could play a great role in terms of protecting their own member police agencies from getting tarred with offering trainings by extremists.
Is there any group out there that's trying to get posted, in each state to kind of adopt those kinds of policies or rules to do exactly what you're saying?
Were you asking me?
Well, sure, you can start, Mark, but if anybody else knows, I'm just curious, is there anybody that's actively, trying to help Post kind of put this together in a way that they can easily roll it out to states?
I don't know that any are actively doing that. There have been posts that have refused to certify Richard Mack events, but I don't know that any are trying to do anything beyond that.
Okay, I'm thinking about our deliverables afterwards, but go on.
It seems like a huge
Yes, Emily.
education opportunity, right, with
Right.
the post situation.
Right, Emily, go
Sorry,
ahead.
Emily.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think this is a larger problem. One of the challenges is Mac has constitutional rights to say what he wants. How it gets authorized and then translated down is, what we can be concerned about, but we can't stop him. But there's really a dearth on the other side. So there's no counterbalance in terms of other types, that we would want to see maybe out there in law enforcement trying to reach these sheriffs. And it's hard because, Mac is telling sheriffs, you get to do what you want. Sheriffs want to hear that. That is a great, it matches their mythological, identity. It matches, how they feel, somewhat ignored in some conversations, that they have this inherited, this American kind of frontier myth. And so it matches, right? A lot of their identity and what they want. And so to be told on the other side of no, you don't have all this power is a challenge, I think, for the space, but also that Republicans have adopted sheriffs and conservatives have adopted sheriffs in a way that, we haven't seen Democrats do. And we see that spreading out. So groups there was a piece by Jess Pishko today that came out in Slate looking at the Claremont Institute, doing these kinds of trainings. There's no similar left-wing think tank kind of trying to organize sheriffs. But I do think it's going to be interesting. Mary brought up this idea of discretion. The sheriff in Texas got really reamed by Texas politicians here in my state, saying you're breaking the law, you're going beyond. The same for the sheriffs who said, I'm not going to enforce abortion laws. It is it's a trickier issue, I think, for the left to try to grapple with what direction do they want sheriffs to play a role in their side.
So is there, there are for police organizations, is there a national sheriff's organization that counters the constitutional sheriffs?
They don't want to touch it.
Well, there is a national organization,
Right.
and I think, and they've got some very fine folks involved in that, and I think it's an issue they probably should touch. I know they don't want to, but.
I think the immediate past president of the National Sheriff's Association recently was quoted. This was after the voting.
Sheriff Contusion?
Yeah, was quoting saying that this is ludicrous, right, and a problem.
Yep.
Right. So,
If I
Go
could
ahead,
just add
Mark,
one
yes.
thing, there was an article that came out this past year that actually said that there were a fair number of constitutional sheriff members people associated with that on its board, on the NSA's board.
okay.
Yeah,
Thank-
one of their board members was at in DC on January 6th. He claims he didn't go in the Capitol, but that he was there, part of Stop the Steal movements.
So we've got a ton of questions coming in. When we were talking about this, trying to prepare for this panel, we knew an hour was not going to be enough time to cover it. I think the most important takeaway for everyone in the room and everybody online is that this is an important development and within the kind of structure of our democracy and the rule of law in our country, and we need everybody to be paying attention to it and looking to groups like all of those affiliated with the panelists on the stage for guidance when you're in your town and your community and you need some help in responding to this issue. And so I don't want to leave without touching on kind of federal law enforcement and local police agencies that have to deal with the constitutional sheriffs. So as we enter the election cycle, and this theoretical problem possibly becomes an actual problem. How is that going to play out from a kind of jurisdictional standpoint and a law enforcement standpoint? What do you see as the best case scenario? Like, what do we want to try to make happen in this situation if we have these constitutional sheriffs doing something that is essentially not founded in law?
Yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit earlier about the jurisdictional issues, right? And so, if sheriffs try to extend beyond their own authority, whether it's their actual, authority to take particular actions or outside their jurisdictions, that poses a problem. And then the question is, what's the response to that? And so, let's just take the example of seizing voting machines. At its best, assuming a sheriff that has authority to investigate election fraud, and wants to seize voting machines as evidence of election fraud, he would still need to be able to establish probable cause to seize those voting machines, and he still couldn't do that outside his jurisdiction. So if he's a county sheriff, he couldn't do it outside there. If there's a city within that county, it would depend on what that agreement is, right? There are also, of course, the federal government has, all kinds of voting rights statutes, criminal and civil, that can be enforced. And so I think this is also, an opportunity to counter those kind of actions. But the fact is, there is vulnerability to a rogue sheriff like a Darleaf trying to muster up, fraudulently or not. Certainly we knew plenty of lawyers mustered up fraudulent evidence to bring lawsuits after the last election, muster up fraudulent evidence of probable cause to try to seek to do something like this. So there really needs to be vigilance. Judges need to be vigilant. Prosecutors need to be vigilant in really requiring substantial proof before any of these type of measures, could be taken.
Heidi, do you have any additional thoughts on that issue?
I mean, my thought is I think in many respects, people at the local and the state level aren't prepared for what might be coming. So the advice that you're talking about, Mary, and getting it out there is like super, super important right now. At this point, the cat's out of the bag with these constitutional sheriffs. We're going to have to deal with them. And I just think there are a lot of people out there who don't realize these things are happening in their own backyard and how critical they could become.
The other thing I probably should have mentioned is that in most states, there are prohibitions on law enforcement being at the polls. And that's because of the intimidation that there can be for people who are exercising their right to vote when law enforcement are there, particularly people of color and minority populations. There are some exceptions, like in Florida, there's a law that actually said there shall be a sheriff at the polls. So go figure. But there is a role for law enforcement at the polls if there is voter intimidation taking placed there, or violations of other laws where, militia laws or what have you, assault, whatever, where election officials, if they see that, they can certainly call for law enforcement to come and help alleviate the problem, but law enforcement themselves should not be at the polls. So sheriffs who say, okay, we're going to deploy out to protect against election fraud, that's going to be a no-no, and that needs to get enforced. If that means the state attorney general stepping in, the U.S. attorney general, whomever.
Okay. All right. Mark, did you have a comment on this issue? Or okay. I wanted to take some, are there any questions from the audience? Yes.
Within a couple of civil rights cases, 1983 judgments served against sheriffs who abused their authority served to defuse this movement.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, are you saying would some cases?
That would seem to be a good strategy to attack these if they are overstepping their constitutional bounds. To sue them on a civil rights case, you get a judgment, you get a court order, and you publicize that, and the movement's going to backtrack.
Okay. Mary, you want to touch on that?
Sure. I mean, so far, to be honest with you, a lot of it is talk, right? You actually have to have had them taken some sort of action that violates civil rights that gives you a basis for a lawsuit. And I'm not saying there's no subtle things going on out there, because even their talk, I think, chills people, right? Chills people from exercising their rights. But you've got to, there's a lack so far of sort of concreteness in terms of bringing a case. I think as we see things escalate and we see this partnership with True the Vote and all this talk about elections, it's quite possible that we will see facts on the ground develop. I mean, Sheriff Lamb last year talked about deputizing a posse to, address racial justice demonstrations, but I don't know what happened with that. Like, I don't know if anyone's rights were actually violated. If so, you could use that as an example. So I think, Sheriff Mack has built his success on a whole lot of hyperbole that probably has subtle influences, but, I think we certainly at ICAP, other attorneys, other places are on the lookout for that kind of thing, and certainly the Department of Justice. So it's a good strategy if we get the right case.
Other questions? So I guess one question I have is the role of judges, and it kind of dovetails on this question. Have there actually been any cases kind of throughout history that have tested this idea of constitutional sheriffs? Is there anything that anyone's done historically that would serve as a basis in law for demonstrating that they don't have this power under our federal constitution or their state constitutions?
I'm actually not aware of any cases, either certainly any criminal cases against any constitutional sheriff, or even any civil actions other than, maybe an excessive force case or something like that. Right. Not like taking on this issue of exceeding authority. I do think, to the extent that we're talking about judges when they're in a situation of approving a search warrant, for example, or arrest warrant, I mean, judges still have to comply with the U.S. Constitution and their state constitutions, which again requires probable cause and things like that, and things can't be done for retaliatory purposes, et cetera. So those constraints all, they should bind the sheriffs as well, but certainly at least judges would be another check on those type of things, which could be why you don't end up with some of the blockbuster cases if they're, if prosecutors are saying, I'm not going to sign off on that warrant. That's my understanding about what happened in Michigan. Darleaf couldn't get any prosecutors to support this idea of seizing voting machines.
Yeah, and Mack has actually built his power by acting as though his Brady case somehow endorsed his philosophy. But of course, it's a completely separate issue, right? It has nothing to do with this sheriff sovereignty.
Right, Mark?
There is one type of case that might theoretically be useful. In some parts of the country, generally the Northeast, sheriffs have a lot less power than in other parts of the country, and occasionally a sheriff will try and sue over their ability to arrest someone or exercise some other power that they don't actually have in that particular state. And generally speaking, the courts have not ruled in their favor. And so some of these precedents in terms of backing the limited jurisdiction or authority of sheriffs might be able to be used, in some other circumstances as well. I say this as not even playing an attorney on TV.
No, I think that's actually very useful. I mean, I think the combination of just the idea that under our federal Constitution, judges have the role of interpreting the Constitution, and legislatures have the role of making law, and so sheriffs are supposed to enforce. That's right. And so, and then with at least some kind of a few cases out there upholding that, I think that's a useful structure for anyone that's thinking about this locally and worried about it. So we've run out of time. I want to thank everyone in the room for joining us today. We really appreciate it. It's been a long conference with a lot of information, and especially to our speakers, Heidi, Mary, Emily, Mark, thank you for all of the work that you're doing in this really important field. So I'm sure some will be around later. Thank you.